Ahoy! It's your old buddy Hambone back again with a coupon code from our friends over at Noble Knight Games. This month's code is RPG City, good for 10% off orders of $10 or more, and it's running now through Saturday, July 31st. And before you check out, be sure to visit Noble Knight's newly launched gaming hall, which is the spot if you're looking for fresh gaming content brought to you by our friends at Noble Knight Games. Noble Knight's Gaming Hall is a great resource to find the latest info about conventions, new releases, tabletop gaming news, and so much more. You'll even find adventures, articles, game tutorials, and unboxing videos, all made for you by Noble Knight. You can access Noble Knight's Gaming Hall on the website or by visiting play.nobleknight.com. And don't forget to use the code RPGCity for 10% off orders of $10 or more, now through Saturday, July 31st, from our friends over at Noble Knight Games.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the founder and publisher of Unwinnable. This is technically the second Delta Green episode we're going to do, and I don't really feel like recycling the joke. Stu Horvath.
The joke has become sort of like this burden that you won't put down.
I will never put it down. If we are doing episodes for this show, I'm going to be doing a joke, or at least attempting a joke, or making a remark about how I don't have a joke until the end. We just did a Delta Green episode, though, like not too long ago, for a different Delta Green book. So it's too soon. Too soon for me to figure out how to recycle the joke. But anyway, which Delta Green book are we talking about tonight, Stu?
We are talking about Arc Dream's 2016 incarnation of Delta Green, which is its own standalone system. No longer is Delta Green a series of source books for Call of Cthulhu.
Very nice. It struck out on its own. It's making its own way in the big city.
It's Laverne and Shirley?
In my brain, it is.
You know, I think it's powered by Apocalypse. It's called Brindlewood Bay. It's like a little zine game. It's sort of like a cross between Murder, She Wrote and The Golden Girls versus Cthulhu, or like Cthulhu Mythos stuff.
Well, I'm sold American.
Yeah, no, it's super brilliant. I kind of wonder what the Laverne and Shirley version of that would be. Like,
it would be me and a bunch of our friends fighting over who gets to be Lenny and who gets to be Squiggy. That's really what it would be. I call dibs on Squiggy. But go on, Stu, tell us about Delta Green.
So Delta Green's super interesting. It's one of those things, again, going back to the original episode we did on this, like I bounced off the idea of being, soldiers and feds fighting Cthulhu. It's a little too X-Files for me. I loved X-Files as a kid. Like when it came out, it was 93. I was in high school. And like, instead of trying even like vaguely to be a cool kid, on Friday nights, I went home and me and Sean Dillon watched X-Files every Friday night because we were hip. Like I love X-Files, but like the idea of playing X-Files in like the Cthulhu setting, like it just never made sense to me. But then I read the books and I'm just like, damn it, I've been missing out. And especially doubly so for the Arc Dream stuff. I think that it's just such a smart system. It's just really well done. The Pagan Publishing stuff is really smart too, but it's also sort of mired a little bit in 90s-ness in that it tends towards edginess that is, it's not, whether you like or dislike edginess. I like a little edge, but it's very much a 90s kind of vibe with a lot of the approach. It's a little over the top. The violence and the sex stuff and like tying that into the horror is done sort of a little less sophisticated a way,
Well, yeah. If you look back in like the 90s, you look at all the people who were working on top in the comics industry, a lot of that stuff doesn't age well for a reason.
Yeah.
And the 90s in a lot of ways was a decade that was really searching for its own identity. When you really look back at like post-Cold War era America, and then what's come next in the 2000s. Like the 90s was that very stuck in the middle generation, and you did have a lot of edginess in everything, be it like television, be it in movies, be it in music, style and fashion. It was very, very edgy, but on purpose.
Yeah, we used to call it angsty, but
yeah, angsty, edgy. I've heard it both ways.
Yeah.
Either way, it was very much not subtle.
No, it was very over the top and very much like overcompensating for whatever else was going on. It was just like, yes, explosions, blood, boobs.
Yeah, man. Lots of explosion, blood, and boobs in the late 80s, early 90s. But this is 2016 when this book comes out, right?
Yeah. So Arc Dream puts out a new version of Delta Green, makes it a discrete, standalone system. So it's still very much based on Call of Cthulhu 6th edition rules. If you played Call of Cthulhu 6th edition, you're going to be able to pick up Delta Green, no problem. Easy enough to convert most of it to 7th edition rules if you're playing, 7th edition Call of Cthulhu. The basic philosophical implements of the game are there. You have a sanity system. It's skill-based, it's percentile. All of it is intact, but there's some key changes. They're small, but like I said, again, they're very smart in just upgrading the game to give it its own feel. And in doing so, it really reconfigures the experience. So for instance, building on Trail of Cthulhu, I know we haven't done an episode on Trail of Cthulhu yet, but we will. One of the things about Trail of Cthulhu is built on Gumshoe. Gumshoe, the idea is for investigative games that it's not fun if you don't get the clues. So when you use a skill in Trail of Cthulhu, you get the clue automatically. Like there's no roll for it. And in fact, you're spending sort of a pool of points to see how much extra clue you get with that.
Oh, I love that.
It's so good.
Love that.
It's so smart. There's no right or wrong here. Like the way Call of Cthulhu has always done it, it's just a different kind of feel. Delta Green does something similar for a lot of the investigative stuff. If you have X percentile in a skill, you get the clue. Like if you have 30% in languages, you can understand the words. So you don't have to roll. Just like Trail of Cthulhu, it makes it like a little bit more like approachable, less frustrating.
Oh, I thought you were going to say fun, but yes, go on.
Fun. Well, I have a hard time using the word fun in the context of Delta Green, and I'll tell you why. The sanity system gets the biggest kind of overhaul, I think. You lose sanity through 3 different aspects. Violence is always going to lose you sanity, which is not always the case in Call of Cthulhu. You can get inured to violence in Call of Cthulhu, especially if you were like in the war and you have kind of like post-traumatic stuff from like being in the trenches. So human on human violence is always going to get you the risk of losing sanity. Helplessness, having read a lot of the scenarios, helplessness is the one that really gets you because you feel helpless a lot. And then the unnatural, anytime you see something that's supernatural, you're going to bug out a little bit. That kind of derives from Unknown Armies. And I think Unknown Armies has 5 different sort of ways you can lose sanity. And I like that. I like the fact that it kind of can come from different angles and like it gives you role-playing cues and it just feels a little bit more realistic or plausible. But the cool thing about it is there's something called downtime now. So in between investigations, you have like bonds which are built into your character. And bonds are other people in your character's life who they depend on, who they love, and who they want to go back home to. Now, this builds from the idea that most of your characters are going to be in some sort of military service, right? Like, you got to survive this so you can see your family again, kind of like military stuff. That's where this comes from. You could use those bonds to save yourself when you take a big sanity hit. Bonds have a numerical rating indicating how strong the bond is. So you can project sanity loss onto a bond and lower that number and not take the sanity hit, but it degrades your relationship with that person. And if it gets to 0, that the relationship is lost and you have to role play that out in these like little vignettes. It's a really great way to sort of spread the cost of horror around. And it makes the game very much about trauma and dealing with trauma rather than just like dealing with the supernatural and going crazy, right? Because like when trauma doesn't just affect the person who's suffering from the trauma affects everybody around them, right? And that's probably doubly true when that person is dealing with something supernatural that they can't tell anybody about, partly because the supernatural is going to blow your mind, partly because you're working for a clandestine part of the government that is probably illegal and very secret. And, if you blab about what you're doing, you're going to suffer repercussions from them too. So like all of this is like, it's about trauma. It's about isolation, right? And the more you get isolated, the more difficult it is to deal with the trauma. So you have to kind of spread the trauma around. It's just really brilliant. And doubly so because unlike Call of Cthulhu, There's not a lot of monsters in Delta Green. A lot of it is human on human or like human on strange thing. One of my favorite scenarios that I've read involves a mathematical equation that drives people crazy and spreads like a virus. And it's brilliant because there's nothing you can shoot. Like that was always my big problem with Delta Green is that like, oh, you're just going to be in the military. So you're going to get ordnance and you're just going to shoot stuff until it stops moving and scaring you. But you can't shoot a math equation, right?
Did no one think of using an eraser?
That is part of the thing, but like it's insidious and viral. So if a photo of the thing gets out, it's hard in a digital world to erase something.
It's very true. I mean, I think that's incredibly clever. I mean, even more so the math thing. It's blowing my mind. I was an English guy though. However,
that's the great thing about the scenario is that like if your characters have no math experience, they're basically immune to the horror. It's great.
Oh, that's great. My dad was the accountant. I am terrible with math. I would survive this. Huzzah! There's always that trope in television shows, being the cop's wife, if you will, being married to someone who's working in those kinds of organizations. And, there is the trauma that comes along with it because you're trying not to bring it home, but you can't help but bring it home. So I think that's actually a very clever thing. Philosophically, though, how does it really work for, Sanity? I mean, now it's 2021. I know this came out in 2016, but 2021, I think it's safe to say that we all look at mental health a little bit differently than we did even back 5 years ago.
Sure.
And I know it seems like a broad generalization. However, especially after the shit show that was 2020, I think a lot of people are really taking their mental health more seriously. And I know that it's sometimes often hard to hear for people that you're losing your sanity, that you're going crazy in games like this. Does something like this that did come along a little later do a little bit better of a job portraying that kind of upset?
So I think that sanity is always going to be kind of fraught in this way. You're never going to have a sanity system in a role-playing game that's going to make everybody feel comfortable, I think. It kind of goes with the territory a little bit when you're sitting down and deciding, I'm going to play Call of Cthulhu or I'm going to play Delta Green, where investigating trauma is part of the game. And yes, it's going to be sort of abstracted and rely to a certain degree on pulp caricatures of mental health. That's sort of the way the language of it works in pop culture. That said, I think you can do anything. You can investigate anything in a role-playing game, and it's okay as long as everybody is on the same page and you go about it in sort of like a way that seeks to be comfortable, even if you're exploring uncomfortable stuff. And Harlem Unbound does that with racism. I think that most modern games dealing with sanity sort of approach it that way. 7th edition Call of Cthulhu does a pretty good job. The problem was always that like you have a sanity affecting moment and now your character is like suddenly schizophrenic, which is just like, that's not realistic, or has multiple personality syndrome. That is just a parody of mental illness, right?
Right.
So a lot of the modern games sort of take the approach where you're having like panic effects in the moment, which feels far less stigmatizing to mental illness and more realistic, more horror movie like. When something scares me, I panic. My kid brings in, a helium balloon into my office while my ceiling fan is on, and it makes a big boom when the two things meet. I jump out of my skin and perhaps yell a little too loudly at the poor kid.
Yeah, man. That would scare the crap out of me too.
My back turned too. It was terrifying. Somehow the balloon didn't pop. Go figure.
They're stronger than they look.
Yeah. I think that panic responses in games are fair game. 7th edition Call of Cthulhu does that, and so does Delta Green. Like helplessness is a really powerful thing. And by making the sanity loss key to helplessness, kind of how you feel when you're helpless, and you can extrapolate that into how your character is reacting to this horrible thing that's happening to you without sort of stigmatizing mental illness. Like everybody knows what it feels like to feel shitty, right?
Right.
The idea is that these sanity systems are forcing your characters to feel shitty on a level that is exponentially worse than you're used to because you're in a terrible situation, which magnifies everything, right?
Yeah, it makes sense to me, man.
And I think that Delta Green does a pretty good job of it. Again, it's all about what you buy into. You use your safety tools. If you're uncomfortable with something or you're struggling with something, like maybe don't play Call of Cthulhu right now. Like no harm, no foul. Like that's a perfectly cool thing to do. Like I had to cancel my Call of Cthulhu game most recently, like just because like I was like having an anxious day and I was just like, I can't do this. So I'm not going to play the game where I have to kill my friends.
Listen, boundaries are important, especially when it comes to murder. All right, man, that's cool because it's something I've often kind of wondered as I delve deeper into the world of RPGs, especially looking back in an era like the 90s, which was, for all intents and purposes, very angsty. Yeah. And everything is on edge. And I think it's important that moving forward, we do establish boundaries within gaming that people will feel comfortable playing those games. But, it's always interesting to see what it was like back then and what it has been not too long ago and what it's going to look like in the future. And it sounds like Delta Green has a pretty great handle on that.
Yeah. By taking monsters largely out of the equation, and there are some monsters, most of the monsters, though, still wear a human shape. And that makes it very human on human horror. And I don't own A Night at the Opera, but I've read everything in The Labyrinth and Control Group and Black Sites. And all of them are very keyed to intentionally exploring certain types of horror. So as the handler, you know exactly what the subject matter is, what it's going to sort of be examining, like what kinds of pressure points the horror is going to hit. So you could be straight with your group and say, like, this is what we're going to be exploring today. Like one of the best scenarios in Control Group is Sick Again. It's about a pandemic starting in a city. Like I'm reading this and I was just like, this is so good. There is no way in a million years, like I could run this even right now. Like it's going to be so long before me and anybody that I'm interested in playing Delta Green with is going to be comfortable with a pandemic scenario. You know what I mean? Like it's just not happening right now.
Oh, hell no. I think 5 years, 10 years is going to be too soon for something like that.
Yeah.
It's too soon, man.
Yeah. Like the cover of that book is like a guy in a hazmat suit with like teddy bear. And it's just like, oh, man.
Well, that's just horrific.
But like, that's what horror is supposed to do. You're supposed to be confronted by horrible stuff and kind of try and process it. It's a safe place to talk about stuff that freaks you out and that is uncomfortable and try and kind of deal with it or find ways to minimize the way you feel. Most horror is built around irrational reactions to things, right? Like we know that it's it's unlikely in our lifetime to have to deal with another pandemic, right?
I want to believe that, but man, I've seen some weird shit in the last 4 years, so we'll see how that shakes out.
I know.
Stu, do you have any final thoughts on Delta Green?
So I think that if you're a fan of Call of Cthulhu, you should check out Delta Green in some regard, even if it's the older 90s stuff. I think that Delta Green is an excellent standalone system that kind of gives you a different flavor for specific types of, Cthulhu infused horror. It's all very modernized. All the takes on the cosmic horror are very new and fresh and different, not at all what you're expecting. You get a whole lot of bang for your buck here while still having a system that's essentially recognizable and playable if you're a longtime Call of Cthulhu vet. If you're just a 90s Delta Green person and you were sort of suspicious or, about the new system, I wholeheartedly love it. I think that one of the best parts about it is that it continues the meta story of all like the stuff that Delta Green's been into, and it blows up so many of the cool things in the 90s and just wipes them away. And I think that's a super brave thing to do. Basically just takes them, throws them in the trash, and says, we're starting with new crazy stuff. And it's cool, because you got to do that with a meta plot. Once they get too big, you got to trash it all, start over.
Exactly. And that's why we're entering phase 4 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
God.
Well, this is another awesome episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast, too. Where can the people find you?
You can find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG, where I'm posting stuff on, all sorts of role-playing games. I just did a week's worth of posts on the 90s Delta Green, and, I bet, I just have a hunch that you're going to see some of the Arc Dream 2016 Delta Green stuff on the feed soon.
Gee, I wonder if that's a thing that we can see sooner than later. Well, you can find me on Instagram at John McGuire RPG. I post there a little more nowadays. I'm going to be on Twitter again soon-ish at John McGuire RPG as more news and information comes out for my RPG 321 Action presents Rocket to Russia. You can also check out our Patreon, patreon.com/vintagerpg. We've got behind the scenes look at Stu's book, still tentatively titled Experience Points. You can get a behind the scenes look at my RPG 321 Action Rocket to Russia. We've also got early release episodes. We've got some behind the scenes stuff. We've got a killer Discord community that we'd love for you to be a part of. Patreon.com/vintagerpg. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.